so serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to episode 585 for May 13th, 2024, and I'm Jaded Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us this week, everybody, for what is to be a really fun show. We are continuing our Best Picture movie series.
Gotta love it.
From the 1940s. We are starting in the 1940s, I'm sure.
Indeed.
If you've been paying attention over the last few weeks, it's been quite interesting, the start of this series.
Yeah, this is our third film in.
We are 3 films in. It's really fun. We've also hit the point in the series where I think it is my favorite part of the series.
Okay.
Where you have an experience that, one, will foster a fascinating conversation regardless of where you stand.
Sure.
And 2, it's remedying a blind spot. I have not seen Mrs. Miniver before the William Wyler film.
Yep, same here. Even though I am quite familiar with its director and his filmography, William Wyler. We'll talk about that as well. But this was much like with How Green Was My Valley being a John Ford film. It was one of the few John Ford films I have not seen. So that was a blind spot for me last week. Same thing goes for Mrs. Miniver for this week.
Exactly, yes. And I love getting to fill in those gaps in your film viewing history. One,
right,
to check it off, yes, but as we'll get into with the review, it's just so compelling to talk about.
There's
so much to talk about.
There's stuff.
Yeah, and I'm very much looking forward to it, regardless of where we stand on the film. It is one of those movies that I think will be interesting to get into. So I am very much looking forward to that in the back half of the episode. As we begin this week, we are going to be talking about franchise movies because it is the summer season after all, and that is the state of Hollywood as we know it, right?
Oh, okay. So we're going to review Spider-Man 2 again like we did last week?
I think maybe we should. So Spider-Man 2, directed by... No, not. We don't have to get into that.
Even as we're recording this, there's still more Spider-Man stuff going viral on Twitter, though.
Well,
there's always something.
The Mark Webb, is that his name? Mark Webb?
The Andrew Garfield films? Yeah, Mark
those
Webb
are now in theaters, I believe.
They are,
so,
yeah, you're right.
More Spider-Man is hitting theaters. It is a web-slinging time to be at the theaters.
Yeah,
and,
I think I'll be skipping those. I don't think I need to go to the theater to see those.
No. However, what I should do is take my wife to see The Amazing Spider-Man 2 because she loves that movie. Loves it.
Well, good taste. It sounds like she likes it more than the first Amazing Spider-Man.
She does. Yeah.
Okay.
It might be the only Spider-Man film that she enjoys, frankly.
Okay. Okay. That's a little disheartening to hear.
But she didn't grow up with it, like I did.
Right.
But she is like Brandy is not a consumer of art like we are.
Which is fair.
She is, I hate to phrase it this way, but a little conventional when it comes to the kind of art that she does intake and enjoy.
She's a muggle.
Yeah, she's a muggle. Like, very traditional, like as a woman, loves her rom-coms, loves like those romantic stories, eats that up. And look, I'm not saying that as a bad thing. That's just who she is.
Oh, no. There are some great gems in that genre as well. Great stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So nothing against the genre, certainly nothing against her.
Right.
That's just who she is. And it is fun to talk about movies with her because that's typically the lane she will stay in, with the exception of, and this is where things get interesting, she loves, and who doesn't, by the way, she loves a good disaster movie. Like Twister is a favorite of hers. I will be taking her to see Twisters day one.
Well, you know,
Very much looking forward to that.
It's not really surprising to hear that, especially with regard to Twister and The Amazing Spider-Man 2, because they kind of embody both of those genres you're talking about in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that's kind of what I'm building toward.
Yeah, Spider-Man 2 is kind of the rom-commy one of them all.
It is.
And honestly, the rom-commy stuff, I think, is the best stuff.
That's what works great in that movie.
Yeah.
The Spider-Man stuff is all over the place and messy. The rom-com of it is superb.
Yeah.
It's really great. Yeah.
Garfield and Stone, great chemistry in that one.
They're fantastic. Electric.
Yeah,
you gotta love
I still
it.
love probably the most iconic moment from that film, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 specifically, when Emma Stone yells Peter and then covers her mouth.
Oh, yeah.
That was apparently a goof. That was a goof.
A goof. Yeah. And that's amazing that they use that.
I know.
Just
it's amazing.
Incredible. Yeah.
No pun intended. It was amazing.
It was amazing. As I stated, their chemistry is electric. See what I did there? Pun intended.
All right, Jamie, you can stop with that now.
At any rate, we're not really here to talk about the Spider-Man movies as much as I would love to, nor are we getting into the box office this weekend with Apes, although I am very much looking forward to getting into our review of Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. Make sure you stay tuned for that. It is coming out tomorrow, probably as we are recording this, or at least as the audiences, as you're hearing this.
Yeah.
The review for that film should come out tomorrow. And I can't wait to dig into that one. That's going to be a really fun conversation as well.
Yeah,
absolutely. There's stuff. That franchise seems to be thriving. And I am more than ready to dig into
we'll talk
that.
We'll talk about box office. We'll talk about the fact that it's apparently part of a 9-film arc now. So there's
stuff. And that's perhaps, I guess, appropriate to the conversation we're about to get into, right? Because that is the ethos of Hollywood right now, especially. They want to franchise everything, and you can't just let a good thing be a good thing. Look, I'm just going to lay my cards out on the table. If you follow me on social media or Letterboxd, you already know this already. I really loved Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. However, they could have just left it as a really great trilogy and never touched it again for another 20 years or whatever.
They could have.
They were never going to do that, given the success of those 3 movies. However, they make a 4th one. I think it's quite good. But of course they are turning this, though, into a 9-film saga. Of course they are.
Thankfully, it's not a 9-film saga starting with Kingdom.
Rise,
Dawn, and War are part of this 9-film saga. So it's not like we're getting 8 more films. We're getting 5 more, apparently.
Yeah. I just hope that wherever they go next, and I know there is some debate to be had about that. I know you're more reserved than I am.
Yeah,
I just hope that wherever they take it, that it maintains its artistic vision and how it is. There with these 4 films, there's been an ambition that you don't always see with modern Hollywood blockbusters. With a 9-film saga on the slate, that suggests that at some point the artistry is going to succumb to the corporate mechanics.
The agenda.
Of it all.
Yeah.
The agenda.
You'll start to, I guess, sense those things when we hear who's directing these other installments. It could be Wes Ball. He might come back for most of them. I don't know. If you see a name like Colin Trevorrow show up, you might think that, okay, we might be in trouble. So we got to look out for that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And look, given Kingdom, I don't think it's quite on the par of Dawn and War, but I still think there is a vision. There's a boldness to that film still, even visually, more so than the trailer seemed to suggest.
There is
I really do appreciate. Yeah. The VFX are incredible.
They're good. They're really good.
So I still think Wes was able to capture that spirit. But given the corporate agenda, will that continue? I don't know. That's where I have questions. I think up to this point, it's been great. I've loved the journey. In fact, I tweeted out over the weekend that I think the Apes franchise right now given these 4 films, might be I think that's my favorite franchise at the moment. That could change, but at the moment, I think that's
between those 4. Yeah.
I mean, I love the MCU through Endgame. Obviously, 4, and as we get into 5, it's been all over the place. It's been a little bit more inconsistent. But at this point, I don't know if there's another franchise I like more.
Well, yeah, and I know we're playing our cards a little bit early here because we haven't even released our review of Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes yet, but it's a film you are higher on than I am, but at the same time, it's still a film I do like, and when compared to the most recent output by anything under the Disney umbrella, there is more pride and conviction in this franchise, at least up until this point. I'm with you. I have reservations and questions about where it could be going, but there are things this new one is doing that at least maintains the ethos of what makes this franchise interesting. And that's at least a good thing. Like there's at least a good thing there.
I agree. You know, because you look at others, Star Wars, again, has been quite inconsistent. They've had some high highs, but some very low lows
for sure
as well.
Yeah.
DC, who's to say? Obviously, the former DCEU wasn't great. Where James Gunn could take it, that may change our minds.
That could be interesting.
Very much looking forward to that. Marvel seems to be readdressing where they're at now, maybe where they go once Fantastic Four comes and they bring in a new Captain America, and who knows with Spider-Man. Maybe where the MCU goes next could,
it could change course. It could really, redirect itself. Yeah.
So like this certainly could change. But I at this point, I don't know. And like the Alien franchise, clearly not my cup of tea at the moment, as we've argued about.
I'm not sure if Romulus is going to change that. I don't
think so either.
And we talk about the Planet of the Apes films being the best franchise today, or at least the one that's still correctly wearing the right heart on its sleeve. It hasn't abandoned that yet. But you can take that all the way back to 1968 because those films, even back then, are still very good and very interesting.
I agree.
Not including the Tim Burton film, because that doesn't really count as canon anyway, even though there are, admittedly, I think there's some decent things in that movie. It's just not a great movie. But those original 5, I think, are still, for the most part, very good and very interesting sci-fi films.
I agree. It's been a pretty great franchise to this point, and it's been, in terms of modern blockbusters, it's been very consistent. Really, I think the only comp I could give it, there's certainly, it's hard to compare the MCU because there's so many movies. And the phases have kind of swayed back and forth. I don't think, like, Marvel from Iron Man to Endgame was still pretty great. Like I loved that whole journey, and
they still felt like events. We were going it still had that kind of ethos.
It was still pretty great. However, the franchise that came to mind, especially because we're talking about more of a singularity here, where the MCU is obviously Thor and Iron Man, and all of those characters came with their own set of trilogies. I think about those first 3 Pirates movies.
Oh my gosh.
Fantastic. Absolutely incredible.
What a trilogy that was.
Absolutely. Like, I would say those films are on par with the first 3 Apes. However, and this is where it kind of sways, right? Where if you're going to be talking about what is your favorite franchise right now, and you're including everything you've seen, well, Pirates 4, for my money, not quite where Apes 4 is.
I was going to say, okay.
That's where it sways differently.
I like Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. I didn't love it like you did, but it is certainly better than whatever the hell On Stranger Tides was.
Exactly.
That is not even a movie. That's not even a movie.
Yeah. So, again, like that's just where the disparity is. Or, I guess to bring it to what I really want us to talk about here, the original Lord of the Rings, one of the best trilogies of all time as well. Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings.
Yep.
You get to the Hobbit movies, not great. So again, that's where the franchise is split. So I can't claim that franchise, even if I agree with the idea that Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings is one of the best trilogies ever made. truly
nothing
astounding.
Changes that.
Nothing changes that for sure. But if you're looking at the franchise in totality, well, the Hobbit films aren't very good. And now we're getting to a new film in that franchise with this Gollum prequel. And I don't know what to think of it.
It's a prequel. Is that what it is?
That's how it's being labeled now. Yes.
Okay.
Which if I am misremembering, forgive me, but that's how it was originally reported.
Okay.
Maybe they've changed it or
I just didn't. I just didn't know. I didn't get any rumbling of when and where this was taking place in the Lord of the Rings timeline. That may have been determined and released in some article, and I just didn't see it. I didn't know where it was taking place. All I knew was that it was going to be Andy Serkis coming back to play Gollum, and he's also directing the film. And that's all I heard. And the only thing that will get me excited for this. And I tweeted this out. If Gollum and Smeagol are the only two characters in this movie, then I'm game.
Yeah, I saw that tweet, and I think what's fascinating about that idea, I'm torn on it because of this. The idea of it just being those two characters, wholly with you. Absolutely. That would be fascinating.
For sure.
Andy Serkis directing that, though.
Well, that's the other side of this.
Yeah. I don't know.
And because if we didn't have the experience of Andy Serkis as a director at this point yet, we know what kind of films he's capable of making. They're not that great. So that's kind of the other side of this coin. I enjoyed Venom, Let There Be Carnage, but that was mostly because it was a Venom movie and not because it was an Andy Serkis movie.
I agree, yes.
Yeah. But his track record as a filmmaker it's not even hit or miss. It's kind of miss and miss at this point.
It really is. And I love him as a performer, especially motion capture. There is just absolutely no debate about it. He is one of the best. He obviously led the charge in many ways, so he knows the technology better than anyone else.
Yeah.
And as a performer on camera, especially to your point, if it's just those two characters for the entire runtime, oh my gosh, that would be captivating. I agree.
I'm with you. Yeah.
And I truly think performatively he can make that work. That doesn't sound tedious. Or irks him in any way. Like I think that is fascinating. But it really does come down to who is behind the camera to make that work. I don't know if he's the guy I would go to.
That's a tricky gimmick to get right. You need a good storyteller and a good filmmaker to get that right, and I'm not sure if he's the right one for it. I do agree, especially if it's not like one of those cases where, hypothetically speaking, if it is only Smeagol and Gollum as the only two characters in this, what if it's not like in a flashback kind of way? What if it's just these two characters talking to each other as if, Gollum's just talking to himself? Everything in kind of in one singular kind of space. That's an interesting idea. I think it's really compelling. I just don't know if Serkis is the right one to actually lens it,
I agree. I mean, Venom, Let There Be Carnage, I agree, was fun, but that was less a Serkis thing. That was more so a Tom Hardy Sony product. That film was always going to be the way it was anyway.
It was always going to be a Venom
Sony.
Movie. Yeah.
Mowgli, I don't know if you got a chance to see that. I thought was really
it's not
dull.
great. It's not great.
Yeah, not very good. Breathe also not very good.
I think might be the best of the three because I feel like there's at least
probably.
But again, I think that's
such a different movie.
This is my thing is that he is he's kind of fitting this description of a journeyman filmmaker, but I think that would even be giving him too much credit because none of these movies feel like they're directed by the same person. It is so wildly inconsistent, not just in quality, but also in vision. They just feel like completely different products.
They do. Like it feels like as a director, he's falling into that George Clooney camp of I'm not really a great director, but I'm good at taking orders and simply delivering what the producers and the studios want.
Right.
And that's why he keeps getting these jobs. Because, it's not even just those three films, but for all intents and purposes, most people behind the scenes, or I shouldn't say most, but a lot of people behind the scenes will claim that he was the one really making the Hobbit movies for all of the troubled production issues and Peter Jackson just suffering personally at that time.
You know what? That's a hell of a theory that actually has a lot of traction, if you ask me. Just given the quality of those films, you watch those films in comparison to something like Mowgli, I can actually see the aesthetic comparisons. I really can,
right? Like it feels kind of the same. Like those movies did not feel like Peter Jackson movies, especially given what we know about him in Lord of the Rings. It makes way more sense that Serkis really was the one taking charge there.
It's funny because of the 3 Hobbit movies, there is one I don't hate. There actually is one I think is pretty good, and it is the first one. But I feel like that would make sense that that's the one maybe Peter Jackson was most checked into. It doesn't, it's until the later installments when he starts to check out. So the fact that it's the most Peter Jackson-esque of the 3 might mean something, right? So I think that theory does have traction now that you mention it.
So that is to say, as much as I adore Andy Serkis, the actor, I am very, very reserved for Andy Serkis, the filmmaker.
Same.
And he's been tapped to direct this Gollum prequel, and I just don't know how to feel about it. So. I mean, as compelling as your theory is, and it really is, I wholeheartedly agree. I'm still dubious, and unless they change course and get someone else to direct.
Maybe they will. Maybe they will. Maybe he's just a placeholder for now because it is his character after all. I mean, the character is kind of his baby. Character was created by J.R.R. Tolkien, but we associate Gollum and Smeagol with Andy Serkis.
We do.
So it is kind of his baby.
And, they say that Peter Jackson is producing this film. I don't know.
What does that even mean?
It's I don't know what
did he just
means.
put up the money to make it happen? Is that all it was?
Maybe.
Yeah.
For all we know, in terms of the actual process, he might be completely hands off.
Yeah.
Except giving a few notes here and there. And in that case, Peter Jackson being a producer does not serve this film. No, it certainly doesn't sway how I view about it.
That means nothing to me. When a great name is attached to a product as a producer or an executive producer, it really doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, I agree. James Cameron gives his thumbs up to whatever this latest Terminator movie is.
Alita Battle Angel.
Alita, no, thank you. Those films are terrible. So it really doesn't mean all that much. Andy Serkis being tapped to direct does carry weight.
Yeah,
and for me, it leaves me quite dubious.
It's not a good weight.
Also, like even if we move away from the circus of it all, what does a Gollum prequel even tell us that we?
What
don't
does it serve?
Know?
We know a lot about him. Yeah.
We already learn about his backstory and everything that is important about the character in the Lord of the Rings.
I mean, yeah, his backstory was the prologue to Return of the King, wasn't it?
Yeah. Like, what could this film give us that we don't already know about the character?
Another Andy Serkis performance.
I mean, it just seems... And again, this is like one of those things where the studios are simply just throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks.
Yeah.
Like, an Apes... Planet of the Apes reboot made a lot of sense. Those original 5 movies did fairly well financially, very well. A lot of the first 4 especially did quite well.
They did very well. Yeah.
It spawned tons of comic books and a TV show and toys and all kinds of things.
Oh yeah, it was the craze until Star Wars came out.
It was a huge craze until Star Wars, right? And then you get the 20 some odd years later, you get the Tim Burton film. That was a big bust, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay, so
but it made money. That's the thing.
It made money. You wait another decade, and you try to give that franchise a boost. What can we do?
Yeah.
Okay, this is a franchise that does very well financially. We want to do it again, but how do we make it something new and refreshing?
Right.
And they come up with an idea that was extremely effective. Obviously,
that worked. Absolutely worked
artistically and financially, which is fantastic. This movie, this Gollum prequel, screams the antithesis to me. Where is and again, I'm willing to eat crow on this if Andy Serkis proves me wrong. Let me throw that out there.
And I want to be proven wrong.
And I want to be proven wrong. Yeah. But as it stands right now, I just don't see a path forward where this film gives us any sort of artistic insight into the character that would be interesting or financially viable. Like I just I don't
see it either.
Like, I just don't see the purpose here. What other characters are you going to? Is this when he has the ring, before he has, or after he lost it?
Well, that begs the question: is there a period in Gollum's life or Smeagol's life that we haven't explored yet that is worth telling? And maybe there is in the mythology of Lord of the Rings that we're just unaware of. I don't know what that is. I genuinely don't.
I mean, we know that there's certainly a pretty lengthy gap where Bilbo finds the ring and he's trying to, I guess, find Bilbo, find the ring. Maybe that's the time period you explore, because I feel like with the films, that's probably the least examined period of his life. But again, I don't know what you could tell us that is like, even though we don't know the verbatim details of Gollum's life in that time period, there's so much that the film gives us, we can infer what his life was like.
Is there an arc there? Like between when he loses the ring from Bilbo and then he encounters both Frodo and Sam, how much of a change has there been to the character of Gollum? At least based on what we see in those movies specifically, it doesn't seem like much.
And we know that he doesn't have the ring.
Right.
And so, like, at the end of the film, we know that he doesn't get it. So what's the plot there? How does it serve the character? Like,
maybe he meets another creature and falls in love.
Maybe. It's going to retcon a lot. Yeah. I don't know.
A Gollum love story is what I want to see.
Again, I'm willing to be proven wrong. Also, I'm not a Tolkien genius by any stretch of the imagination. I am currently reading the Lord of the Rings books for the first time right now. I don't recall if I talked about this openly here on the main show. We talked about it quite extensively in our VIP bonus content last year. If anyone wants to subscribe to Patreon or the YouTube channel. But last summer, we talked a lot about the Harry Potter novels because I read those for the very first time, and we had some fun conversations about them here on the show. It was a great time. So I am now delving into the Lord of the Rings books for the first time. So I am admittedly a novice when it comes to the written realm of the Lord of the Rings. I don't know if there's anything in the books that might be inspiring this narrative.
Another song,
which in all transparency, I am completely skipping through. They go on way too long. I'm sorry.
Who doesn't love a long song?
It drives me crazy.
Who doesn't love a long song?
I can't do it for those that love the Tolkien songs in the books. God bless you. I'm glad that you enjoy them. It is so grating to me. I just can't do it. I can't do it. I skip through the whole thing. I
forget if I asked you this because you're reading these books via audiobook, correct?
Yeah.
So are these songs actually sung in the audiobook? Oh, they're okay. So they're sung. All right. That's not as terrible as like imagine trying to read that back in the day when audiobooks weren't a thing and you had to kind of create your own melody as you were reading those lyrics in order for it to actually justify its existence. Would have been tricky.
Yeah, for sure. I can't do it. Like it completely disrupts the momentum. I think that's what I find so irksome about it is that you're compelled by the characters and the drama and the action. And then all of that halts for a 4.5 minute song. that tells me very little about the characters and where they are. Like maybe the first few lines are like, okay, I get the gist of it, but then it goes on and on.
Yeah. It's like imagine watching
on.
one of your favorite musicals only to find that the songs actually mean nothing to the story.
just doesn't add anything to the story for me.
Yeah.
It just doesn't. If it does for everyone else, great. But for me, it adds very little. And it halts the momentum that I think is very interesting. So like, I'm glad that by like toward the middle of Fellowship, that does start to dissipate quite a lot. There's still a few in the back half, but it's not nearly as often.
Yeah.
And I'm at the beginning stages of the Two Towers. So I don't think there's been any, maybe one little one. But it has, again, it's been mostly about the drama and stakes, and that's what I love. But
right.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Long story short, I'm going through the novels for the first time. Maybe there's a Gollum Smeagol thing within the novels or the lore and the mythology that I'm just unaware of, that Serkis, who did those audiobooks, by the way.
Right.
He's the one that did them. So he is very, very intimately familiar with this material. So if anyone has a through line on where to take the character, it certainly is him.
It's him. Yeah.
No doubt about it. I'm just basing my sentiments here off of what I know about the character based on the films, and I assume that Andy Serkis is taking the characters from the movies, because this is a film after all. He's not writing a novel.
No,
it's another movie that's going to take the character that we know and love, and they're going to add something to it.
Yeah.
So based off our experience with the films, what can you do in film form that will reinvigorate this character? I don't know.
I can't think of anything. Please the exec at Warner Brothers. That's what I think is going to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I guess that's a lot of
they're
words
the
back to
audience
that.
here.
Yeah. Okay, so we're pretty dubious on that. I do want to move on to the next segment here. Wait, and I feel like this is becoming a weekly thing, unfortunately. But the passing of Roger Corman over the weekend.
Yeah.
I do want to touch on that. As sad as the passing is, also it's also, I guess, not too disheartening in the sense that he lived to 98 years old. He had a really full life, which is very exciting, and also his legacy is simply untouched.
It's simply untouched. You're absolutely right, and I love that we're celebrating a figure like this. I mean, he's mostly known as someone that's kind of behind the camera more than anything else, right?
Yeah.
He was a producer. He was an executive producer, and he was very much tied to what they dubbed as kind of the B movie guy, right?
Yeah. He revolutionized independent cinema and B
absolutely
movies, for sure.
And I think while it is so disheartening to see a great name like this pass, even though he did live to 98 and had a full life, as you said, there is something kind of heartwarming about the celebratory angle here.
Exactly. And that's, I guess, what I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
Yeah. Like the fact that we're celebrating someone who revolutionized not just film, but was also very adamant about supporting female filmmakers at the time as well. And I think it also says a lot about our relationship with Hollywood nowadays, that this is someone that really revolutionized B entertainment specifically. And it's kind of a form of entertainment that I think a lot of us miss nowadays. So I think it just goes to show how his impact is something we want to even see more of nowadays. And this is really sparking that conversation.
Absolutely. And speaking of impact, I think it's worth noting some of these names because his impact is, again, it's untouched because who he gave opportunities to and who he championed during one of Hollywood's most important times is incredible. So you think of Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, James Cameron, Joe Dante, Jonathan Demme, Peter Bogdanovich, Ron Howard, Jack Nicholson, Pam Grier, Polly Platt, like all of those names, and certainly many more. We have to thank, like we have Corman to thank for them being a part of cinema history.
He's kind of an unsung hero in many ways.
Yeah.
So he's the kind of figure you're going to see a movie made after. There's going to be a biopic on him now. And I think it's one that is worth telling because of that impact that he had and how he was integral in all of these different cinematic pieces. It's such an important story to tell and such an important figure here. I was even looking at his filmography of some of his most notable works that he really helped fund and get made, and just how they had this like lasting impact. Most people associate a movie like Little Shop of Horrors with the musical, but the original 1960 film was kind of his baby, and that's a great movie from that era.
Yeah, absolutely. So like in terms of his legacy, it's astounding like how deep and far and wide it goes, and it's a name that you'll see linger around for a long time to come because his imprint is still all over Hollywood in many ways. And that is worth celebrating. And it's, I think heartwarming is a great way to phrase it because you've seen an incredible outpouring from so many directors and actors and producers, anyone still working in Hollywood. And even if they're not, like people are just pouring out all kinds of love.
That's the thing. We see a lot of celebrity passings where there's a lot of word of mouth around that passing, a lot of support for that individual. But the word of mouth here for Roger Corman's passing is kind of loud. There are a lot of people talking about him.
A lot of people.
Yeah.
Yes.
And to the average person who isn't as tied to movies like we are, you might not even know who Roger Corman is. And that's what I think is so amazing about it. I hate to say the word amazing with regard to someone passing, but there is something amazing, quite incredible about that. You're really trying to promote the impact that he made.
Yeah, absolutely. And while I listed a handful of names there, I mean, the list goes on and on. There's certainly many more I could have noted there. James Horner, among others, Curtis Hanson. I mean, a lot of names fall under his tutelage that we have to thank for. For him, for all of these artists that we adore and love now, they all come from him. And it is interesting that it's a name that is absolutely not a household name for most people. I absolutely agree. But you wouldn't have known that based off of the outpour of love and reflection that we saw over the weekend when they announced his passing. It was truly incredible to see that because, we get this all of the time. I somewhat noted that at the beginning of this segment that it seems to be something that is sadly a recurring segment on this show in recent weeks. And yet, as sad as those passings are, I feel like the vast amount of outpour that we got for Roger Corman, you just don't see every week when you get these announcements.
Oh man!
Not that those people don't deserve it. They certainly
do. Everyone does for their own reasons, one way or another. But the loudness of Roger Corman's support is quite incredible. Which means does that mean it's more likely that the Academy is going to forget about him for the next in memoriam segment at the Oscars?
Well, that is a great question that I will leave to Shadon and Erica on Chasing the Gold to talk about. We're
giving them material to talk about in their next episode.
Yeah, they can certainly handle that. But, he's certainly going to be missed even at 98 years old. I was reading that he was still, working. He was still tapped into what was going on to some degree. And so for sure, he's going to be missed. And you're right, we're probably going to see a movie based on his life. It's absolutely worth telling, given the amount of cameos that will come and go throughout a movie like that.
Yeah,
it'll be astounding.
It will be.
It'll be crazy.
It will be. Yeah.
Very, very much looking forward to whatever that might be. But at any rate, certainly rest in peace, Roger Corman. Our thoughts go to his family and friends for sure.
Absolutely.
Real quick though, and forgive the severe tonal change here. Before we get to Mrs. Miniver, real quickly, it's not often that my thoughts in a movie heighten to a degree that is noteworthy when I look at a poster. The footage, yes. A trailer, sure. A clip, I can react to that. But the poster to Nightbitch did everything that a poster could possibly do. Like, I don't know if I need to see a trailer, although I'm looking forward to it. There's something about that image that evoked feelings in me that I don't know if I can articulate here on the show. All I know is I loved it. And I am all the more excited now.
All Amy Adams has to do is read the dictionary and is going to be the most compelling thing that year.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's the beauty of that poster, because the poster itself is not really anything special, but it understands the importance of a great actor. That's all it does. If it were any other actor, that poster might not land as well as it does. But it understands It understands the importance of Amy Adams. The simplicity of just that notion, I think, is what makes it effective.
Yeah.
It almost doesn't even matter what Amy Adams is even doing on the poster.
And that's a great point, because you think about Amy Adams, her greatness as an actor, and oftentimes on the show, what do we talk about? We talk about performers that act wonderfully through subtlety, and the director simply putting the camera on the actor's face and letting them emote, letting them physically just give you something.
Yeah.
Now, Nightbitch does not sound like a movie that will be full of subtlety, and I say that as a good thing. It just
the movie sounds
like
hilarious.
It's going to be incredible, maybe over the top, who knows. However, that same ethos, though, does apply to this poster, because you're right. It's just a close-up on Amy Adams. There's a little black on the outside, and then just the name and Amy Adams in lettering at the bottom. Right. With the tagline, which I love, by the way, "Motherhood is a bitch." Perfect. Just kudos. Absolutely love that.
Oh, I cannot wait for that.
The majority of the image is just a close-up on Amy Adams. That's it. That's really all that it's doing. And a great performer such as Amy Adams can do so much with a close-up. And there's something about her eyes, the hair dangling in front of her face, and this kind of rustic look on her. Oh my god! Just
stand up for a little bit. Just stand up for the scene. Look, it's doing the same thing right there, right there.
Exactly. Another moment of subtlety in that movie.
For sure.
For those on the audio, I'm wearing our Amy Adams T-shirt.
Yep. From Arrival.
Store.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's what I love about it's just the eye work, eye work. And a little bit of the makeup and hair, I guess. Because I love the way the hair falls. I love how it looks like she hasn't showered in 6 months.
You're right. There is kind of a griminess to
There's a griminess to it that is fantastic as well. And she looks like, and it's funny because in our household lately, we've been joking about how our dog Dakota has taken up a job in coal mining. Because we'll let him outside and he comes in and he is filthy. And he has especially because he's older, he's got more white hair than usual, and especially on his nose and on his paws.
So you notice it more easily.
So when he's outside digging and it gets all dirty, so it looks like those old school photos of men coming home from working in the coal mines and they're covered in soot. That's what this looks like. Imagine 101 Dalmatians when they cover themselves in the soot to hide the spots. That's what he looks like.
That's what he looks like. Oh man, thankfully he's not a Dalmatian.
Dakota's back from the coal mines. So that's the fun joke in our house. That's kind of what this poster reminds me of. Like she's
Reminds of your dirty dog.
she's like a dirty dog. Otherwise, a night bitch, I guess, is the other way of phrasing
we're not
that.
saying like she's not a dog. She's a dirty dog.
Yeah. At any rate, I love this poster.
I love
think
the
it's
simplicity.
great.
I can't wait for this one. This was one of our most anticipated for quite a while, and we're finally getting it this year. And I think for a lot of us, it's not just the Amy Adams of it all. It's also the Marielle Heller of it all,
Exactly,
the filmmaker
yeah.
behind this, who as far as I'm concerned, for her 3 narrative films, she's 3 for 3. And I think her films are actually getting better as time has gone on. So I'm really looking forward to what she does next.
I agree. Brendan, I love coffee. I don't know if you know this about me. I love
Liquid dessert, man. Liquid
I
dessert.
breathe it. I live it. It is one of the best parts of my day. And I don't want to waste my life drinking terrible coffee. It's just not in my DNA.
Why would you be excited to get up in the morning for something like that? You want something that's worth getting up in the morning for.
Yeah, that's why we love Coffee Cult, because they source specialty grade coffee from all over the world. And it's delicious. If you don't know what specialty grade coffee is, we're talking the best of the best. We're talking high-end gourmet coffee that tastes as if it is the nectar of the gods.
The champagne of coffee.
Exactly. Like it's amazing. And not only that, but Coffee Cult goes a step further, because specialty grade comes in these packages and it's not filtered out. It's just whatever the crop is. And sometimes the crop has defects in it, beans that have turned black, all of that is a part of it. And a lot of coffee companies will just roast whatever is there.
Whatever's there, yeah.
Whatever's there, whatever they get. But Coffee Cult filters out those defects. And so they only take the pristine green coffee beans. That's what they roast. They have specific roast profiles for the coffee as well to enhance those flavors even more.
Oh, it's
and
so good.
what you get is great coffees that, depending on the profile, you get these organic flavors of chocolate and nuts and honey. Sometimes it's fruit forward, so you get these elegant notes of blueberries and strawberries and peach that I absolutely love.
So good, man.
In fact, this week they are launching a new coffee that is this rare Bourbon Sidra coffee is what it's called.
Interesting.
And that's the variety of it.
Okay.
And it's this rare coffee because Bourbon is a variety, but it's like crossbred with a different variety to bring out these really lush, like tropical fruit flavors. That is incredible. And that's a limited edition. So there's only a handful of those coffees available.
I need to get my hands on that. That sounds so good.
So if that sounds good to you, head on over to coffeecult.com. That's coffee with a K, cult with a K, coffeecult.com. Use our code at checkout. That's ISF. Again, that code is ISF. You'll get 15% off with our code. So go and check that out. That's coffeecult.com, and we thank them for their support. Brendan, can I offer you the InSession Film Store?
You always can, especially if we have shirts that look as good as the one you're wearing right now.
Yeah, so I'm wearing our Amy Adams Arrival design right now. For those on
it's
YouTube,
so good.
You can kind of see it.
For those on YouTube, stand up a little bit more. Show the whole thing. Show the little quote underneath that. Look at that beauty.
You got the quote here, and of course Amy Adams there up at the top. I love how it turned out.
Because who doesn't want Amy Adams slapped on their chest?
Exactly. Love this shirt. So this is available right now. You can go and check that out as well. And I proposed this on social media last week, and honestly, I think I'm going to put it up. So there's a new design that I did last week based off of the Fall Guy.
I love this. We sort of thought about it mid-review when we talked about it last week.
Yeah, and I came up with a design that I really liked. It's just God, now the quote is escaping me.
Nihilism is the sexy bacon.
Nihilism is the sexy bacon. Yes, that's it. And of course, that's one of the quotes in The Fall Guy.
Yeah.
And I love how this design turned out. If you're listening on, or if you're watching on YouTube, I'll put up the design here so you can see what I'm talking about. And if you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify, just go to our social medias. I threw it out there last week.
Looks awesome.
Or maybe just go to our store, because I think I'm just going to put it up. So InSessionFilm.com/store.
I think you should just put it up. Yeah. What's great about this is that it doesn't necessarily have to associate itself with The Fall Guy. That is just a great quote nonetheless. And I think you just like you want something like that on your body. Like that's something you get tattooed on you. Nihilism is the sexy bacon. That is beautiful.
It's so good. Like it's it's one of the best lines I've heard all year. Nihilism is sexy bacon. Absolutely love it. So yeah, that shirt is going to be available. I'm just going to put it up on the store. So go to InSessionFilm.com/store, or just go to our store directly on TeePublic. That's tpublic.com/stores/InSessionFilm. One more time, that's tpublic.com/stores/InSessionFilm. And it'll be one of the new designs up there, so you can go and check that out. But I'm very much looking forward to getting one of those. So
me too.
So we're gonna put that up there. But we have all kinds of T-shirts up in the store. We got a La La Land and Moonlight inspired one. We got Turning Art into Sports, of course. We have that one up there as well. We got all kinds of fun things. It's growing every single week, which is kind of exciting and fun. So, go and check that out. It's a great way to support us, and you get to wear awesome T-shirts. Yeah. Pretty soon, I'm going to have to come up with a Nightbitch themed T-shirt.
Oh, it's coming. Yeah, it's coming.
I love that poster so much. So, I'm going to come up with something. I can't wait. I kind of just want to take that photo from the poster and do something with
I was going to say, do something like that. Maybe make it a little bit more animated if you want to be a little bit more colorful with it. I don't know. It's up to you how you want to handle that. But, man, that'll give us 2 Amy Adams themed shirts.
I know.
In our arsenal.
I just love me some Amy Adams.
Yeah. And if we want a third one, it'll just be a picture of Amy Adams. That'll just say, because Amy Adams is great. Just that's all you need.
Another thing I might do is, I don't know if you were paying attention to the meme of the weekend, which was putting Koba into every other movie.
Oh, yeah. That became a thing.
Were some glorious Photoshop Kobo memes. I might just turn some of those into T-shirts.
I think my favorite one was seeing him next to Val Kilmer in Heat.
Yeah, that was a good one. Yeah. Yeah, there was some great ones. I might have to just pick one or two and see if I can get permission, because oh my God, that was so good.
That was a great gimmick.
At any rate, the store is a fun way to support us. And let us know if you have an idea. We would love to hear from you. So let us know. Again, InSessionFilm.com/store, and we thank you for your support. All right, with all of that said, Brennan, let's go ahead and transition to our Best Picture movie series, which, as we noted up at the top of the show, we are starting in the 1940s. We've done 1940, 1941. Now we're to the films of 1942, where William Wyler's Mrs. Miniver wins for Best Picture. It was nominated, I think, for 12 Oscars.
It's huge. It won 6, if I'm not mistaken.
6. Yes.
I think it was the first film to receive 5 acting nominations.
Crazy. Absolutely wild.
This one kind of set a standard in some ways.
It did. Yes. It was highly, highly regarded at the time. And given the context in which this film was made, which we'll absolutely talk about, it is crucial to the conversation surrounding this movie.
Right.
But given the context at the time and what this film was trying to do, I think there's certainly a level of, you might not agree, but maybe an understanding why people went for this movie.
There's an importance to it.
There's certainly an importance to it. And it's been a film that many people have still regarded, regardless of where you sit on it.
Oh, yeah.
As a Best Picture winner, or even in terms of what the film might be doing as a work of art, or as a work of propaganda, as many people might argue.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
As I noted at the beginning of this conversation, I think that's what makes the film so fascinating to talk about, regardless of where you land on it. And I'm very excited to get into it. So with all of that laid out, let's go ahead and jump in. Mrs. Miniver, Best Picture winner for the films of 1942. It is directed by William Wyler, and it stars Greer Garson, who won for Best Actress, alongside Walter Pidgeon, Teresa Wright, May Whitty, Henry Travers, Richard Ney, and many others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with Mrs. Miniver, it is about a British family who struggles to survive the first months of World War II.
Yep.
All right.
That's all you need to know. That's all it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's very simple, and that simplicity adds so much context.
With that said, Brendan, what did you think about Mrs. Miniver?
So I'm really curious about this conversation, JD. There is a lot to talk about here, and a lot of what we have to talk about doesn't always funnel, or at least come from the movie itself and how it functions as a movie. It's more so circumstantial as far as when it came out, what it represented. It's obvious that people went for this in 1942, especially from a British standpoint, because if I have my history right, it was 1939 when they entered World War II, England specifically.
Yeah.
That's only 3 years before this movie comes out. So it is so historically, socially, politically top of mind for audiences that it just, it makes sense as to why the response was so high for this. And I really do get that. It is also pretty interesting that this is a Best Picture winner from William Wyler, because we're going to talk about him again during this series in just a few weeks.
Yes, we will. Yeah.
Good filmmaker. Good filmmaker.
Yeah,
He's got a lot of good films. Yeah, it turns out he's pretty good at his job. I think Mrs. Miniver is one of those films I'm going to learn to like more as I revisit it, as I talk about it more. At this point now, I think it's a film I love the idea more than I do the film itself. I like a lot of individual scenes. I love a lot of what it's trying to do. I think there are great things in this movie. I'm just not sure if it all comes together in a seamless way that makes it a great film in totality. And in a weird way, it kind of reminds me of some of our reservations we had about How Green Was My Valley. I think there may be some inconsistencies as far as the narrative through line that connects all of these things together, because a lot of the people that we meet, including the titular Mrs. Miniver herself, they sometimes feel like ciphers for these ideas on anti-war for this time. And I don't know if they're fully fledged characters or people, but I do love this idea that we're basically getting a war film that doesn't really feature much physical war in it. It's more so how war affects everyday people. Now, there are some moments of combat and action of a sort throughout, but it is very minimal. In fact, it's more interested in how people are able to maintain composure for an annual flower competition. Yeah. I love those ideas. And I think if I were to give the film more time, if I sit with it for a longer period of time, if I give it a few more revisits, I might learn to love it, because in that process, I will get to know the characters more. But I do think just on this first viewing, I'm not sure if it's fully there as a film, but I love what it's aiming for. And I love what it was able to do historically. We'll talk more about that. If you actually read the trivia for this movie on IMDb, it's fascinating. It really is quite fascinating. And we'll talk about some of those things for sure. But I do really like the movie for what it represents. I think I'll learn to like it more as I ponder on it further and talk about it more. Yeah.
This is a film that somehow I actually kind of dig, weirdly, even though it's extremely messy and disjointed. Yeah. Or as Dave Giannini, our editor-in-chief at InSessionFilm.com, as he put it, it's jingoistic hogwash, which I thought was hilarious.
Oh, he is not afraid to speak his mind. I love it.
He is not. Love it. Look, as we've been talking about, this is a film that needs to be taken into context. Its propagandistic ending is tacky in hindsight, but we have to remember that this came out in the summer of 1942.
Yeah.
At that time, the war was still very far from being decided.
Yeah.
In fact, it was inching closer and closer to its most pivotal stages, and the world was at stake, very literally. Tensions were extremely high. Germany was quite formidable at that point.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of uncertainty, especially with America having not entered the war yet.
Right.
So its jingoistic ethos, at least I think, are reasonable given that context and the precariousness many would have been feeling. But that's what makes art so alluring. It captures those feelings and repurposes them in a way that can often feel cathartic. We just witnessed this with the pandemic and films in recent years that did the exact same thing. It's why Mrs. Miniver ended up winning Best Picture. It's why Hollywood made a lot of these kinds of movies during the war. People wanted to channel their fears and uncertainty into hope and confidence.
Yeah.
And films like Mrs. Miniver can do that. Now, in retrospect, does that render the film a little conspicuous and jingoistic? Absolutely. Yes, it does.
Yeah.
But it wasn't trying to appeal to audiences in 2024 who already know the outcome of World War II. Its audiences in 1942 would have been trepidatious and quite nervous. And I think this film taps into that psyche very well. At times, this film is visceral, quite visceral. Those bunker scenes are genuinely harrowing. The sound design to this film is astounding.
Sure.
And then there's moments and aspects of the film that are juxtaposed that render this elegant beauty and levity even throughout this film. I think of something like that hat sequence you get at the beginning is so weird and a little bombastic, but I do kind of love that.
Sure.
So like there's these weird tonal shifts throughout the film that I think are indicative of what the everyday person would have been experiencing, as you were somewhat alluding to there, how that is jarred when war comes to your front door again, very literally.
Quite literally, yeah.
Absolutely.
Which is a great scene. I really did like that scene that you're alluding to there.
I agree. So like those tonal disparities here, I don't quite mind. In fact, they're welcomed in a movie like
They're
this.
kind of needed for this. It showcases the challenge of trying to maintain normalcy when you're just living your everyday life and war surrounds you, right?
I agree. I completely agree. And that's what the film is ardently trying to convey. And while messy, yes, I think it's mostly effective in that regard, maybe primarily because of Greer Garson, who is spectacular in this film. I think her performance is really, really fantastic, deserving of her Oscar win. And I think she really holds this film together when at times it might falter and stumble a little bit. I think she's the glue that makes it work. So
that's fair.
I don't disagree with your criticisms or a lot of the criticisms out there. And yet I still found the film kind of arresting.
Oh, I did too, for the most part. I do like this movie, and I'm probably going to learn to like it more because those gaps that I feel about it now will probably come together as I feel like I get to know these people more and more. Because outside of Mrs. Miniver, I do agree that Greer Garson's performance is in many ways the thing that fills in the gaps for her character in particular. I still felt like there are other people here that I wanted to feel more acquainted with. Such as her son, Vin, and the relationship that he develops with Carol, played by Teresa Wright. I think there's a great introduction to their dynamic, but when their relationship starts to blossom into something more, and then it leads to certain outcomes that are a bit unfortunate, I'll simply say, I wish there was more time spent with even them that I might learn to find as time goes on. But everything funneled through Mrs. Miniver herself, I do think is quite compelling. And the film is aware of that. Characters even speak to that. At one point, I believe it's the Lady Belden character played by Mae Whitty, who says, quote, you have such a way of looking at people. She says that
that's
directly
one
to
of the
Mrs.
lines
Miniver.
of the film for sure.
It absolutely is. It's and I'm not trying to be, I guess, intelligent with my picking of that line. It's a very obvious and notorious line for this movie that really represents a lot of what her ethos as a character is about. That she is someone that's very good at looking at the good in people and trying to find the good in people, which is what makes that encounter with the German soldier very compelling. I do think that is a great scene. I feel like that's the scene where the film really does start to come together a little bit. You know, like the threads that kind of disperse between these multiple scenes that sometimes just feel like a series of scenes. It's when things start to feel a little more tightly knit. I think is when that scene kind of starts to bring things better together. But yeah, I do think Greer Garson's performance is really the key for making it all work.
Yeah.
And still to this day, I think she gives the longest speech for Best Actor winning.
Yes, that is true.
5.5 minutes, I think her acceptance speech was. So that's pretty incredible. So I think she still holds that record, which is really interesting.
Yeah. And again, given the context of the time, I think it makes a lot of sense. For me, Kay, who is Mrs. Miniver here, Kay Miniver is her name, and Greer's performance, it is the nucleus of the film, and I find her to be really great, especially when you're trying to push back against the film's propagandistic criticisms. And I do think those are very fair. I think they are very fair, especially when you talk about, let's say, that final speech at the end, which is politically charged. However, I think if you remove that, if you remove that final sequence, I don't think the film is as jingoistic as many might claim it to be. If you, like, for me, it's way more concerned with these characters and their relationships that they have with each other, especially Kay, who's not only a wife and mother, but we see her relationship with Carol blossom over the course of the film. It's her endearing exchanges with Mr. Ballard, and Henry Travers is incredible in this film as well. And
at times he gives my favorite performance in the movie.
I'm totally there with you. And it's her relationship with Lady Belden, played by Mae Whitty, and how that evolves. Or you look at the fascinating relationship, as you noted, of Carol and Vin, and how the looming war affects their decisions. The war might have a say in how these characters react, but it's not the fundamental driver of them. In fact, there's not much urgency into the war is literally at their doorstep. For most of the runtime, it's primarily a romance slice of life movie where Kay finds herself navigating through these various relationships. And I love how the film deconstructs her as it goes, because in that opening scene where she's buying the hat, she does come off as this spoiled wife to a wealthy husband, and she loves to shop and spend money and be luxurious. But we come to find out she's not really defined by those things at all. She's much more down to earth than that. If she's defined by anything, it's her ability to compartmentalize each relationship and bring a true honesty to it. That's really what the film is about. The final sequence might forget that for the sake of political urgency and wartime uncertainty, but that is the beating heart of it.
Yeah.
And I think that is important given what's at stake in terms of the war, that the relationships in our lives, the normalcy we try to manifest, that is important. Not necessarily for jingoistic purposes and let's support the war effort. But in terms of getting through this experience together, especially personally, in terms of relationships, like maintaining that composure is vital. And I think that's ultimately what the film is getting at. And I think it does does it in a sincere way. Even if it's messy at times, that sincerity comes through.
Well, first off, I think Mrs. Miniver has probably one of the greatest character introductions of all time with that scene with the rose, which I think is quite pitch perfect. And I do want to talk a little bit more about that closing speech at the end, which interestingly I think was written the day before it was filmed. The actor who delivers it, Henry Wilcoxon, and director William Wyler apparently wrote it the night before it was meant to be filmed, which I thought was a pretty interesting piece of trivia.
The script generally evolved over time because of real-time events unfolding.
I also wonder how much we will be looking at the film in a jingoistic way if it weren't for historical circumstances and what that speech at the end represented, because this is a very well-known and famous speech for this time. Because it's not just famous for this movie, it was also distributed across many American and European radio broadcasts after it was completed. It was huge on, I think, like Time Magazine as well. I think President Franklin D. Roosevelt, ordered it to be broadcast on the Voice of America quite often. So it circumstantially, it became this kind of, I guess, propaganda piece. But in the context of the movie, I think if you remove that historical connection, it does feel like a message of hope for a small sliver of people trying to find hope amidst a torturous situation. I think if you were to just look at it in the context of the film, I don't know if it's as jingoistic as the film's reputation seems to suggest. I sometimes wonder if it's just history that is maybe kind of clouding it in that way. So I don't know. There is still something kind of perhaps jingoistic about it if you were to look at it in a more high level way. But I still saw it as very minimal and very segmented to this specific demographic, which I thought it worked in the context of the film. I do wonder if history hasn't been kind to it in that way. So I think it's a very fair question. I'm not sure. I'm not saying it does or doesn't. I honestly don't even have an answer to that question. But it does make me wonder if history would have been different if it wasn't so infamous for this time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I guess even though I did like the film, I admittedly found that final sequence to be alarmingly patriotic. It tonally maybe misguided.
Maybe, and I think it might be it might be the tone of it more than anything else.
It could be the tone of it, and also the history of it. It is a speech many people will recognize, even if they don't recall it coming from this movie. It was absolutely utilized for jingoistic purposes.
It was.
There's no doubt about that. But art, like religion, like other aspects of life, can often be reinterpreted and manipulated for something that it wasn't intentionally used for. We'll talk about that with Planet of
Proxima Caesar, baby.
We'll talk about that. Look, that historically has absolutely been a thing that happens often. Now, that said, I agree with you, but I also do think they wrote that for patriotic purposes.
They probably
did. It does feel that way. But I don't think you're wrong in the sense, given where this film leads to narratively, with the stakes that it employs, literally life and death, and the war still lingering there, that to offer up that little moment of hope, even in the context of this film, like if you remove the politics of it, I think you make a great point. I guess I'm also curious now to hear what you think of the flower scene, the flower competition scene, because upon this viewing, and again, to reiterate, this was the first time I had seen this film as well, like you, I do think it's a bit of a mixed breed of the film's relational complexities crystallizing in this endearing and unifying way that removes class dynamic, that removes political divide. It's a community coming together to bring normalcy in a time that is anything but normal. And while part of that unification is rooted in the wartime of it all, for sure, and that might give it similar jingoistic qualities, up until the sirens at the end, it's just as much a fusing of all of these characters that we had witnessed throughout the entirety of the movie coming together in a single space and fully realizing the drama the film had set up earlier, specifically Mr. Ballard's Rose being in this competition, even though Lady Belden tried to convince him not to be in it. And of course, Kay is caught in between both Mr. Ballard and Lady Belden. If you remove the war context, I absolutely love how that plays out given the characters, who we know them to be, and the choices they make in this sequence. I absolutely do love that. It's fantastic. The performances are astounding. There's so much to love about that scene in a vacuum, but it does end in a way that reminds us that the war is still very much ongoing. And similarly to that final sequence, I can see how that rug might be pulled out from under you, and it feels maybe a little propagandistic, even though I don't think it is. I could see why some would respond that way, and given what you laid out earlier, I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, the flower competition scene, I kind of have two minds for. I think I'm more in defense of it than I am critical of it, though.
Okay.
I think if I have any criticisms of it, it's more so how it fits within the context of the narrative flow of this movie, because it's getting into some new themes around class and the dynamics there that almost feel like they maybe interrupt the thematic ethos of the film overall. It almost sometimes feels like it comes from a different movie, which is really maybe my only criticism of it. At the same time, I was kind of thinking, this could have been a very compelling movie if this was the final scene before the sirens even start sounding, and it reminds us that the war effort is still surrounding them, so that it is able to find this moment of hope and peace despite the looming war effort. So it actually has sort of a moral for everyday people to strive for, right? And that you can't forget that. It's the same reason why these two characters of Carol and Vin, despite how young that they are, still choose to get married, because they want to find some sliver of happiness, even if it is short-lived. And I feel like this competition scene is sort of representing that idea of trying to at least find a little bit of peace and happiness, even if it is short-lived, because you can't just simply wallow in the misery and fear all the time. So as high level and simple as that might seem, I like that idea. And I think there's something compelling on that notion, even despite the classification themes that are overarching it as well, which I think are interesting and they're worth talking about nonetheless.
Yeah, I will defend the class dynamics a little bit in the sense that I do think the film gives us that throughout the movie. It might not be as prominent as all of the wartime
for sure
drama and urgency, but I do think it's there. Particularly when we meet Lady Belden. I mean, even when Carol brings her up to begin with, there is this aristocratic ambiance to the character.
Yeah, that's fair.
And even the same thing with the Minivers themselves. They have wealth, and there is a dynamic between the Minivers and, let's say, the maid that works for them.
Yeah.
And that's something that is not forgotten throughout the film either. And the film, I think, sets it up quite vividly early on when we see the maid working for the Minivers, doing various chores. It's maybe most prominent when Vin first gets to the house after he comes home from college, and he has this very stiff upper lip about everything. Like he's like the definition of pretentious. That's who Vin is when he first comes on screen. And they're having some conversation. And at one point, the film, again, not subtle in this at all. I forget the exact phrasing, but he says something about the British class system. Like he speaks to it directly, and he makes a reference about how, I don't know, like how egregious it is or whatever. And the maid is literally standing in the background hearing all of this.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
He even looks back at her at one point, like, "Oh, you're there. Can you please go get me a drink?" or whatever he says there. Like, there's a fun irony that the film is playing with there, you know. And later on in the film, as the stakes get higher and you see the unification of this community, another thing that happens is that the Minivers, and forgive me, I can't recall the character's name here off the cuff, but they go, Gladys is her name.
Oh,
They go
yeah.
to her house, they talk with her husband, and you see those two families come together in that moment and spend some time together again, conveying a unification because of, again, what the world is at stake.
Yeah.
So, and I think generally as well, like the way they depict Mr. Ballard, it's clear that he doesn't come from the same money as Lady Belden or the Miniverse.
No, he's
so
a bell ringer, essentially.
He's a bell
right?
ringer.
Yeah.
So like the film might not have been about those things directly, but I think it had spent some time setting those things up, that when you get to the flower scene competition, that the class dynamic and removing that for the sake of unification, for the sake of who wins and who loses there, and why that's important. That, I think, to me, that's why it's effective. Even if the film wasn't about class dynamics most prominently, it's there in a way that I do think is like it earns that moment, I think.
I think that's a fair point. I think if anything, maybe my reservation is less so about the class dynamics in that particular moment and how the film maybe goes about trying to connect those ideas on class with the war effort that's going on simultaneously. I'm not sure if the film had done enough of the work to make those two themes kind of marry together in some way.
Okay.
And those are two things that I think historically, socially do make sense together. I think those are themes that do belong in a similar vacuum. I'm not sure if this film did the right work to tie those together. So when it gets back to those themes during the flower competition, I was still thinking about how the war effort was affecting the Miniver family specifically. I was still thinking about Mrs. Miniver's encounter with the German soldiers specifically. I was still thinking about the bunker scene, or the idea of Vin and Carol getting married so young because he is a flyboy, and they are worried about how that could affect their relationship, that they just want to find happiness for just a small sliver of time. So when we do return to those ideas on class, I did feel a little bit of the tug of war. Even though I think I think it is worthy, and it does still work, because we are still reminded of those themes on class in the earlier segments of the film, primarily due to how great Henry Travers is as Mr. Ballard. I think, if anything, we talk about Mrs. Miniver as a character and Greer Garson's performance being the nucleus here. I think more credit also has to go to Henry Travers for maybe being enough of that nucleus around those themes on class, because you remove the war effort here, you still have a pretty interesting movie nonetheless. It's maybe just the tying together of those two extremes that I think the movie maybe needed to tighten a little bit more.
Well, and look, I think that's very fair. It might coexist a little bit better for me because I don't think the film calls attention to it outside of that moment early on with Vin, when he more or less is winking at the camera when he's talking about
as
class
this
dynamics.
Oxford student coming back, he's just reading books about it, so he's obviously an expert on this.
Exactly. And Gladys again is standing there in the background when he's making this commentary about how outdated the class system is in England. It is a winky moment for sure. Outside of that, though, I don't feel like the film calls attention to it as much because it's much more organically woven into the film and with its stakes, and especially with Kay and who we know her to be. Because as we talked about earlier, what's great about this film, or at least what I found so appealing here, is that it's way more about Kay and her relationships with all of these individuals, whether it be with Vin or her husband, the younger two children, or it's her relationship with Carol, Lady Belden, Mr. Ballard, or even Gladys. Like, we see her dip her toes into all of these relational waters, and seeing her navigate that as the dramatic urgency of the film unfolds, I do think the film ratchets itself a little tighter in a way that, at least in terms of fusing those two things, felt a little bit more organic. Now, I will say it's still a little jarring. It's still a little uneven. As I noted in my opening thoughts, I recognize the messiness there. especially when you also couple in the jingoistic mechanics of the film that at times it is quite noticeable. But I think the film is able to fuse those two things, K and class dynamics, in a way that for me felt mostly seamless. Like when they go to visit Gladys, for example, that whole sequence isn't about class dynamic. Is it there on the surface? Absolutely, because they do come from two different classes. But the heart of that moment is about unification based off the dramatic urgency of the scene. I mean, her interactions with Mr. Ballard, even early on, you can physically see that they don't come from the same space in terms of English structure. Yet relationally, it's extremely endearing. Like that moment when we first see her interact with the rose, and he tells her, "I've named this after you." Charming, it's a great moment with a capital C. It's incredible.
That's a heck of an introduction.
Or I think about her conversations with Lady Belden throughout the film, with Carol throughout the film. Like she's always navigating these waters in a way that, for where the film goes dramatically and narratively, it's how she's able to, again, compartmentalize and also bring a unity to everything. So when we get to the flower competition, I think it's primarily about the crystallization of her navigating these relationships, especially as it relates to Mr. Ballard and Lady Belden, for sure. But those class dynamics are still there. It's not what the scenes are about, but I think it's there underneath.
Okay.
And because the film sets it up earlier, and all the examples I mentioned earlier, I do think the removal of it, again, the film doesn't tell us that. It just shows us that unification, that I think it works. But you are right. What we're primarily focusing on, what the film is emphasizing, is Kay's relationships with all of these characters. It's the moment of Vin telling her that he's going into the Air Force. It's the German soldier scene, as you noted earlier. It's Vin and Carol talking about their marriage and why they're getting married so young, as you talked about. Like, that's ultimately there. I just think some of these sub themes are woven in mostly seamlessly, at least much more comparatively to something like How Green Was My Valley.
I mean, this is still a tighter film than How Green Was My Valley. I'll give it that. And if there is a major defense I would have for those ideas on class, it is the thing that brings Carol and Vin together in one of my other favorite scenes in the film. That is kind of winky at the camera. The argument that they have when they're first introduced to each other, I think, is like the second I saw that happen, even though it is a quote unquote argument, I knew, okay, this means these two characters are going to end up together, right? It's like the tone of it is there. So I
love the way she gets him, like the way she kind of undercuts.
Oh, she wins that argument hands down. I think
really
Carol's
great.
a fascinating character nonetheless for that reason. But yeah, like that's where I would certainly defend a lot of the inclusion of class dynamics here, because it is the thing that brings the central other romance together in the film. And I do think the play between those two characters and the two actors there are very good in emulating that. Although I think it's kind of funny knowing some of the true stories around this movie, thinking about that central romance, because for one thing, Greer Garson is only in real life 12 years older than the actor who plays Vin, Richard Ney.
Yeah.
And the two of them got married after this movie was made.
Wow.
So she married the man who played her son in this movie in real life afterwards.
Old classic Hollywood.
Classic Hollywood.
Gotta love it.
Marry your children.
Yeah, that's quite strange. And I do love the whole Carol Vin dynamic throughout the film. I think is really fantastic. And I guess my last point on the class stuff, because I don't want to spend I guess we've already spent too much time here.
Yeah, we always find things to talk about. This is
I think it's woven pretty seamlessly into the film, subtly for the most part, outside of a wink or two here and there. Maybe what I love so much about it as well is simply Henry Travers's performance as Mr. Ballard, because he is
really
so
great.
good here.
It's really great.
So endearing. And you think about what happens at that flower competition scene and how that plays out. It's heartwarming. You can't help but love it. Also, given the stakes of this film, there's a line of dialogue at the end of the film that gives more weight to it as well. And so
the fact that something about him happens off screen.
Yes. Yeah. So there's something about his inclusion here that I think gives the film weight. And and I guess that is the power of a performance, because if it was any lesser than what Travers gives us, maybe I'm with you. Maybe it doesn't work quite as much. But I like the subtlety of it for the most part. And I love the Travers part of it. Like, those two things work for me. So when it crystallizes the way it does, I was wholly invested in how that plays out. And also Garson as well. I want to give her credit, because the Mr. Ballard relationship is great as well. It's not just Travers, it's his interactions with Garson as well. As limited as they are, I think they're fantastic in some of the better scenes.
Yeah, and Henry Travers was one of those 5 acting nominees for this movie.
That was nominated, yeah.
Yeah, Greer Garson won, as we already mentioned, and Teresa Wright, who played Carol, she also won for Best Supporting Actress. But Mae Whitty was also nominated, Henry Travers was nominated, as well as Walter Pidgeon. So those were the 5 there. And the 2 women, coincidentally, the 2 women who then become named Mrs. Miniver in their own way, are the ones that win the award for Best Actress and Supporting Actress, respectively.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, let's talk a little further about Teresa Wright as Carol. Okay. I'm curious what you think of this. So I think she's a great character. I love her. Loved Teresa Wright's performance. She's absolutely fantastic. Now, I do think she kind of, in a way, becomes a pawn for the film's propagandistic mechanics in the end. I'm curious what you think of this. She's, throughout the film, extremely charming. She has an enthusiasm that's palpable. We talked about how she undercuts Vin early on. There is this just this captivating allure that she carries. And then narratively, about halfway through the film, I do think that maybe the writing of the character starts to fizzle out slightly, and she becomes representative of something else as it relates to the war. I don't know if we want to talk spoilers. I'm obviously trying to dance around them at the moment. But given where that character goes in the end, and I think of 2 moments. I think of the moment when she's talking about Vin and she says something along the lines of, well, it's war. I'm prepared for this. I'm expecting it. There's that moment. And then there's ultimately the car scene near the end.
Right.
I love the character. I don't know if I fully love how it crystallizes, because it does feel like it's, I don't know, maybe giving stakes to the film because of the wartime, and maybe it's the execution of it that I don't love. I don't know. I feel like the writing of the character is a little underwhelming to me, even though I think for most of the film, she's one of the best elements of it.
I kind of think the character's underwritten.
Maybe that's it.
Yeah. When I go back to my opening thoughts, that there were things from a character standpoint that I wish I just had more of an acquaintance with. Like, I feel like I haven't gotten to know every character in the way that I think the film wants me to. She was one of those main culprits there. I think when we praise Carol as a character, if anything, we're really praising Teresa Wright's performance. And it's not really a performance that I think fully fills in the gaps that I think the film needs for that character to really sing. It's just such an adorable performance. You just can't take your eyes off of her. I think, and as much as I love both Carol and Vin's relationship, I think they have great chemistry. I think Vin is also kind of an underwritten character. I think on their own terms, I wish that there was more development for them. So when it does veer into this this climactic final moment that you're alluding to. I wish more work had been done to turn them into people as opposed to just ciphers for those themes. And I feel like that's more or less what they become, Carol in particular. And it's a shame because I do think her winning Best Actress makes sense because it is such a charming performance. You can't take your eyes off her. I couldn't. I developed a bit of a crush on her watching this movie. She is so cute. She is so adorable. I wanted to talk to her. But I also think she was a little bit underdeveloped, just given where that arc crystallizes in the end.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think Vin has more texture to him as a character, especially in the first half of the film. Once he signs up to become a pilot in the Royal Air Force, it does fizzle out. That character fizzles out.
Yeah.
And we don't really see him for much of the back half of the film. And it's a little bit of the same with Carol. Like once they get married, she simply becomes this pawn for the film's agenda. And I don't love where that goes, especially because like I don't fully love the car scene near the end when all of the stakes start to manifest themselves a little bit, because it feels...
I like it cinematically. I'm not sure if I like it narratively.
Yeah, it just feels a little manufactured to me.
Which
like
is fair. Yeah.
Like for a film that is extremely visceral and pragmatic in its bunker scenes, which hands down some of the best scenes of that era, as far as I'm concerned.
I'm with you.
Those scenes are incredible.
I think the aircraft scenes surrounding the car scene, I think, are pretty effective, especially for their time. That's why I like it in a vacuum. I think the way it functions as like an action set piece in a way, I think is effective. But I'm not sure if I like it in the context of how this film focused more on the everyday surrounding war.
There
was something very contained about the film until we got to that point, and then all of a sudden it gets so much bigger in a way that I'm not sure if the movie really deserved. It kind of abandons what I thought was so interesting about the whole sense of place of it all.
Yeah. And I think maybe that's where execution simply matters here, because that car scene takes place after those harrowing bunker scenes.
Right.
So for Kay to simply make the choice she does is extremely illogical. And while I'm not trying to get bogged down too much in that, it's enough that it takes me out of the moment. It takes me out of the moment. It makes absolutely no sense. She's so much smarter than that. That to me is where the film, you can feel the seams moving. You can feel it being tethered together, because
that's a good point.
It's manufactured in a way that is false. And so much about that character is not that. It is the opposite of that.
Right.
And so when you see it, it's noticeable. And even narratively, even if I'm moving outside of that one specific choice, narratively, I just feel like Carol becomes a pawn for the film's themes instead of what the film was trying to do in terms of navigating, these relationships and why that's important in terms of, the wartime and normalcy and all that sort of stuff. Now, given the stakes of it, I understand why the film wants to include that level of gravitas and dolefulness. I do understand it. And I think maybe that's where execution simply matters, because it to contrive it that way, it reduces what is a great character into, I don't know, a thin piece of paper that is maybe propagandistic in the end.
Well, I think that's a good point. This is where I think you can feel that the movie was at times written and changed on the spot.
And maybe and we know that to be true about the screenplay, and that's probably where that comes from.
And that's a hard thing to be able to achieve in a way that feels purposeful and balanced. I think the best example of a film that was changed during production because of wartime, but still felt like a very seamless piece of entertainment, was Hayao Miyazaki's Porco Rosso. That was a film that he constantly shifted and evolved because of the Gulf War, I think it was, and his relationship with that. But he somehow made that work.
Yeah.
Here, you can kind of feel the breaks and the severing of those lines that don't quite coalesce into a seamless piece of art. I think you can really sense those puppeteering strings kind of pulling those things together, or at least trying to, and I don't think they always work.
And to your point earlier, while I think overall this is a much more seamless experience than something like How Green Was My Valley,
sure,
but it has a similar nucleus in the sense that at its core is Carol and all of these relationships. Last week we talked about how that film was 5 movies in one. Well, in this film, Carol has a dynamic with her husband, with her kids, with Carol, with Lady Belden, with Mr. Ballard, and it's trying to balance all of those dynamics, like all those relational dynamics.
Yeah. For the most part, it's pretty effective.
And I think it's pretty effective. I agree. Yeah. But I do think that maybe that's where the film kind of suffers, especially when you're making changes on the fly as they were, because Vin and Carol early on are great. I love that Vin early on, he is this pretentious college student. And even in Richard Ney's performance, he's initially very grating. And I
wanted to punch him in the face 5 minutes in.
Yeah. Like he's annoying. And the character is meant to be, which is why it's effective. Now, once the war effort picks up, you see an evolution in the character and the way he approaches his family and the way he approaches Carol. And of course, falling in love with Carol certainly has a bit to do with that as well. So like, it feels like they have as much texture as anyone else here. But then once he leaves for the Air Force, he's pretty much out of the movie. And Carol is just there as a wife waiting to become a widow.
Yeah.
And that's all she is through most of the film, which then the film ironically turns on itself.
Which is an interesting change of fate. I like the idea, but I don't necessarily.
It's the execution.
It's the execution because it turns that character into a cipher for something else, and it sacrifices the character in doing so.
I agree. So that's really my reservation there. But I think Carol overall is still fascinating, and Teresa Wright, I agree, very, very great here. Very
charming, so cute, adorable. So cute. Yeah.
Going back to Greer Garson, I want to talk about her a little bit further as well.
Okay.
What I love so much about Wyler's direction here, I think he does his damnedest to make all of these things as seamless as possible. It's not perfect, but I think he does a pretty good job with it. What he does the best, though, one, he brings depth to this film in terms of its photography. I think the cinematography and effects work here is incredible.
It's a very good-looking movie. Yeah.
The sound design is incredible. The comic timing, when he does go to levity, I think all of that is very astute as well. And I think about how he uses the camera to complement Garson's performance. We talked about this weirdly, ironically, I guess, a little bit with the whole Amy Adams Nightbitch Poster. But that same theory applies here because Wyler at times doesn't do anything overly complicated. When it comes down to the moment and we need to see Kay's reaction to something significant, he doesn't overthink it. He simply lingers the camera
very static.
Statically on Garson, and boy, does she deliver.
In fact,
she is so good.
The camera rarely ever moves during dialogue scenes. It's actually pretty amazing.
It's really great. One of my favorite scenes of the film is, I noted it in passing earlier, but that moment when Vin announces that he's enlisted, and you get this medium shot on Garson, and it lingers there for quite a few beats. It's this long, lingering moment where we see her wrestling with that decision. she's trying to engage with, my son just enlisted for the Royal Air Force, but she can't tell him no. There's a lot at stake. A lot of people are enlisting, yet she's palpably fearful. It's this incredible moment of acting that I absolutely love. One of my notes here, you talked about it earlier, is that moment when she's told, you just have this way of looking at people. It really is one of the lines of the film, because her reactions throughout this film are just mesmerizing.
Yeah,
absolutely terrific.
When Kay is convincing Lady Belden to let Carol and Vin get married, and the argument she has, the research that she has done, and I'm using that term not even loosely, I'm putting quotes around research, because that's exactly what Kay says. I've done my research on you, Lady Belden. It's and correct me if I'm wrong, but that conversation they have with each other, it's a static shot that never moves.
Yeah.
But it's placed in a way that's primarily focused on Mrs. Miniver herself. We get more of a side view of Lady Belden and how she's turning to look at her. She turns away, she turns back, she turns away. But we're focused on how Mrs. Miniver looks at her and how she's kind of like is my job working? Am I convincing you? It's it's kind of a clever thing that the movie does by simply not really doing anything technical. I really think it's great.
It's a great piece of writing. I do love that about the exchanges between the two characters, because Lady Belden absolutely comes in with a firm stance on what she believes. But by the end of the conversation, she is completely won over. And I think that's what's so great about Kay and why she's so enthralling as a character. She has this way about her that, again, completely is in contrast to those opening scenes and how we view her.
Exactly.
She's way more down to earth. She's smart. That's why the car scene is so weird to me, because you get this moment that you're talking about where she's done her research. She comes off very smart and convincing, and she is both of those things.
Yeah.
So why does she make the decision she does in the car? I don't get it.
That's funny.
But
it's
you are right. That is a really great moment that I love as well. And of course, Garson is really terrific in playing that up. Or I think about her moment with the German soldier, how she reacts to that. Again, like, it's this weird combination of fear and uncertainty, but also showing compassion at the same time.
It's a mixture of both. Like, it doesn't humanize the German soldier that much either. He's still
very one note.
But even so, he's very firm with his beliefs. He even openly threatens her. But at the same time, you also can sense that he does seem to be thankful and appreciative of her support in that moment. So there is kind of an interesting idea at play. That scene could have been a full movie, and it would have been potentially interesting.
I agree.
And even the way it resolves itself, you could take that scene from the movie and look at it in a vacuum, and there's a lot to dissect from it. But a lot of it is because of performance, because of Greer Garson in that moment.
Yeah, I agree. She's fantastic. I also love her interactions with her husband Clem as well throughout the film.
Walter is really good here too. 2 movies in a row we have him in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think of that moment. I guess there's a couple of moments when he comes home from the whole Dunkirk sequence.
Yeah,
it's actually quite funny how it plays out. Where he simply wants to go to bed. There's a funny exchange there in the bedroom. He gives her a little slap or whatever because he knows that he's lost the argument. Once again, she wins an argument.
Yeah.
And it's not about her winning the argument. She's just smart and clever and funny, and she gets the best of Clem in that moment. And I love
so of course
that
a man's
dynamic.
response is to, resort to violence to prove their point.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe a little bit of an indictment there. But on the other end of that spectrum, tonally, I think about those scenes in the bunker, the conversations they have, the trying to maintain normalcy when that is impossible. The way they comfort the young children there is great. Like, she tries to find this grounded normality that is ultimately ripped away in those bunker scenes, but there's something so comforting about the character that comes through just wonderfully in Garson's performance. So like it truly is a masterpiece of a performance.
It really is great.
I can't find a single flaw. Like, she's really, really terrific in this film.
how does the movie work without a performance that good? Does it even work at all?
I don't know if it does because, again, the film isn't about, at least I would argue, isn't about its jingoism. Certainly, that's a part of it. The film is called Mrs. Miniver. It's about Kay's relationships with all of these other characters. That's what it emphasizes the most. And you need a performer to make that work, especially given that the film does bounce around. And
yeah, agreed.
Man, I think she more than succeeds in that regard.
I think she nails it. Absolutely nails it.
Any final thoughts? Anything else you wanted to mention here?
Well, going back, I guess, to the propaganda a little bit, and this is, once again, the trivia surrounding this film that I think is pretty interesting. Apparently, Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, grudgingly praised this movie for its depiction of propaganda. But it was sort of like an unfortunate praising. It was more like his realization that, okay, yeah, this movie's doing good things, and I wish it wasn't. But this is what he had to say about it. He said that it shows the destiny of a family during the current war, and its refined, powerful propagandistic tendency has only been dreamed of. There is not a single angry word spoken against Germany. Nevertheless, the anti-German tendency is perfectly accomplished. So it's an interesting thing. So hearing that come from the enemy side for a movie like this, I think is a pretty interesting thing. Whether you agree with the film's I can't even say that word, propagandistic notions. Is that even the word for it? Whatever.
Yeah,
okay. If you agree with its propaganda or not, it's at least fascinating that someone on the German side said it did it well. At least that's the perception I get from his words there, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I do understand the argument that the film is telling the audience to maintain composure, maintain your resolve, support the war, support the soldiers that are going to fight. In 2024, it might be jingoistic hogwash, as they've put it. That might be how it feels today. But I think context, again, is so crucial here because in 1942, there was so much that was uncertain.
Yeah.
It was a very real possibility that Hitler could have won the war. It is vital to understanding this film. It was a very real possibility in 1942.
For sure.
Which is why the film is a tug of war between propaganda and art. But I think it gets way more right than it doesn't, especially because of the performances, as we've been talking about, the consequences of some of the stakes that we see. I question the execution, but I do think there is narrative and dramatic purposes to it beyond just the propaganda.
Yeah.
I still think there's artistic choices being made that serves these characters and what we had seen throughout most of the movie. So it does end in a way that is a little bit doleful, but it's also trying to promote this hopeful optimism as well. Obviously, given that iconic speech that you get there at the end, for sure.
Sure. Yeah.
And look, if it was me, I would have taken that out. But I'm also saying that through the lens of 2024. Knowing that, England and the United States win the war. They didn't know that in 1942.
No.
They didn't know that.
That does change things. That really does change
things. The
things.
United States hadn't even entered the war yet, technically.
That makes an interesting point. Do these situations in these movies, war movies specifically, do they come off as less jingoistic if the outcome is our failure? I do wonder about that. There are a lot of comments out there about a movie like Black Hawk Down, for instance, being very jingoistic in its portrayal. And you and I both agree that film really isn't very jingoistic at all. But
yes, I thought about that a lot with this film as well. Yeah.
But that's a movie that portrays a situation where our involvement really is not a victory. So does that lessen the jingoistic qualities then in the general sense? And I think it is a fair question to ponder on.
Yeah. I mean, if you go and look up a map of Germany and its occupied territories in 1942, it is pretty bleak.
It is
quite bleak. They obviously had Paris, they had the Netherlands, Poland, Norway. I mean, that whole area, Romania, North Africa, like they had all of that. Italy, of course, was part of the same power, so that comes with it. Bulgaria, like that whole area, like Switzerland somehow was the only one to escape. Germany somehow, like they stayed completely neutral. And for whatever reason, Germany was like, fine, we're okay with that.
We're okay.
But you look at a map of Germany in 1942, and it is bleak. I mean, like Great Britain was literally the only thing keeping Hitler from achieving, and I guess maybe the Soviet Union, but I don't think the Soviets in Germany were quite going at it in 1942. I could be mistaken there. I'm not sure when Hitler made that shift. I have to go look that up. But broadly speaking, especially as it relates to the Western Front, Great Britain was the only separator there. And by this time, they had won the Battle of Britain. So the Royal Air Force had done its job, but Britain was really the only thing. And it obviously wouldn't be another 2 years until D-Day. So, like, you know, even after the release of this film, they had to wait another 2 years before there was any advancement in the war at all against Germany.
Right.
I mean, there's just a lot of tension, a lot of tension.
You're right that it's very bleak, and that bleakness maybe adds some context as to why that ending really worked for people at the time. And if the outcome was any different, we might look at it a little bit differently nowadays.
Yeah, and maybe it's just the history nerd in me that understands where this film is coming from.
Yeah, because
I mean, it's like the chances of Hitler winning the war at that time were not small. Not small at all. Like Germany was dominating the war at that point.
They were.
And you know, for a film to understand that the world is at stake, I mean, it couldn't have been more cartoonish.
No, it certainly doesn't defend the ending in its own way, but it does provide the right context as to why it definitely worked for people at that time.
Yeah, you might laugh and make jokes now, but like at that time, the world was literally at stake, and England was the only thing that was keeping Hitler from advancing across the seas and maybe even to the eastern part of the United States, which at one point we knew Hitler wanted to do. If he had overtaken England as they wanted to in 1940, it's very possible the United States
could have fallen. Yeah,
could have had a Germany attack, kind of attack like Pearl Harbor, but probably in New York.
Yeah,
like that was very much a realm of possibility.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I mean, understanding those fears is so important to the context of this film. And it's why I understand the criticisms. I don't necessarily disagree with them. Maybe I'll push back a little bit as I've done in this conversation, but it doesn't bother me like it does a lot of other people.
No, and I'm kind of with you. At least taking it in the vacuum of that scene that we talked about earlier, I think looking at it in the context of just this small demographic of characters that are represented here, the small English village that we're focused on, I think it limits the jingoistic qualities a little bit more. It makes it a bit more personal and humane.
Yeah,
and I was able to support it in that regard too.
Yeah, and as we've been talking, like the film is primarily about Kay and this community and her relationships.
It's not about all of England, even if the final speech kind of seems to represent all of England. It's not really about that. It's really about a sliver of England.
I agree. I mean, I do think in some ways, like criticizing the film for its jingoism is you're criticizing like a small sliver of the movie comparatively to what it is. I would argue.
Yeah.
I would argue.
Yeah, and as we keep saying, it's because we have a different context nowadays. We have more knowledge than the people making the movie at the time did, and that makes it unfair in some ways.
Absolutely. Okay. I think with that we can end the conversation there, unless you have anything else you want to add about Mrs. Miniver.
Good movie. I'd say of the 3 films we talked about in this series thus far, I think Rebecca is still my favorite, but this is a close second.
Man, I see, because I was kind of mixed on the ending to Rebecca.
I know. I was curious how you felt about this.
Rebecca is so great up until then, though, that I do think it's a better movie, but maybe only by a hair. Like, maybe not by much. Mrs. Miniver, I did really like. This is just quintessentially why I love doing these series. You get these fun surprises like this. I had never seen this movie. I wasn't exactly sure what to expect, especially given some of its reputation. You don't see this as a heralded Best Picture winner.
No, but it is the kind of movie that probably should be taught in history classes. Because of that significance
for sure. For sure, absolutely. And I can understand why it's not quite as revered. And again, maybe it is just the history nerd in me. I don't know. But there's something about the history of the making of this movie, the history that is incorporated into it, that fear and uncertainty of 1942, which I think is so prominent in this film. Yeah. That I kind of love about it. Like, I don't like it. The film might be telling its audience to maintain composure, maintain resolve. Yeah. But when you're at war and there's a lot of uncertainty, like, to me, that's not propaganda. That's an artistic choice that, that conveys an idea just like anything else. Yeah. Yeah. At least that's how I interpret it.
I'm with you.
At any rate, those are our thoughts on Mrs. Miniver. If you agree or disagree, if you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please reach out to us on social media or Letterboxd. We would certainly love to hear from you in that regard. We are now 3 films deep into this series, which is very, very exciting.
I know.
Have you seen any of the other films that this was up against?
I've seen 2. Okay. I've seen 2 other films it was up against. Those 2 films being The Magnificent Embersons and 49th Parallel. And both of them I prefer over Mrs. Miniver.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I'm kind of there with you in the sense that I've also seen The Magnificent Embersons. 49th Parallel, I don't recall, unless that was a college film. Or like a film I saw in college, rather.
I caught up with that one fairly recently after our good friends Ryan and Jay, when they were still doing extra film, were in the middle of their Powell and Pressburger series, because that is an Archer's film. Yes. So I was genuinely curious how it stacks up with their other works. And I do think it is a very good film. I like it slightly more than Mrs. Miniver.
Okay. I think I've seen The Talk of the Town as well.
I can't recall if I have. I don't think I have.
Yeah. Pretty sure I've seen that one, but a lot of these others are admittedly blind spots for me as well.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, there's a lot here that I haven't seen.
I'm probably with you that I also prefer Ambersons.
Okay.
A troubled production, but I think Orson Welles directs the living hell out of that movie. I think it's great still.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that would have been my vote, but I've only seen a few of these, so take that for what it's worth. But I appreciate, admire Mrs. Miniver. For what it is, for all the reasons we talked about.
Absolutely.
All right. And then next week is a big one. Huge one next week as we get to this little film called Casablanca.
Never heard of it. Never heard of it.
So don't know what this thing is. Look out for that next week. Very much do look forward to getting into that. As we wind down the show here, a couple of plugs, reviews. I noted earlier we have Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes coming out. We're also going to be talking about the foreign film La Chimera. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but we're going to be getting into that movie as well. If you missed it, we have reviews last week of The Fall Guy and The Idea of You. If you want to go and check those out, that was a lot of fun talking about those 2 movies. Women in Session has a new show out where they do another critic spotlight. This time, our very own Nadine Whitney was on that show. That was a lot of fun.
Great stuff.
There's also a new Chasing the Gold, where the ladies talk about the best comedies of the year. including The Fall Guy and The Idea of You, among a few others. So you can go and check all of that out as well.
Yep.
If you want to support the show, become an InSession Film VIP. That means supporting us on Patreon, or you can on YouTube. You can join up through YouTube memberships or Apple Podcast subscriptions. Those are great ways to support us and getting access to our bonus content.
Indeed.
And of course, you can email us, InSessionFilm@gmail.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, all of that fun stuff.
All that jazz.
Brendan, any final thoughts before we get out of here for the show this week?
Well, for those who watch us on YouTube, hopefully you enjoyed my background for as long as you did, because it is finally changing next week.
It's
you can even see it's the Mad Max reference. You got the barren wasteland behind you right now. Things are slowly trickling out. Tomorrow when we do our reviews of Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes and La Chimera, I'll still be here, but that will be the last episode that I do in this room, because we are officially moving out this weekend. So change of scenery coming. It probably won't look as artsy because it's only a temporary situation, but you'll have to deal with it. So I even have to get used to it. I'm not even sure if I'm going to like it. It might be the most uncomfortable thing ever. I've gotten so used to this setup. I have to find a way to keep my bass guitar in it. That is a priority. So I have to find a way to make that work.
Yeah, we joked last week that Brendan's going to be recording these shows from his car for the next month and a half.
There might be one episode I do from my car. For those listening, I am not living in my car during this time. So just to make that clear.
I wouldn't recommend driving it though, for some transparency here, and I'm not even sure if you remember this or not, Brendan. We attempted to do a show once when I had no other choice because of timing. I had no other choice other than to do the show from my car as we were driving to Disney. I don't know if you remember this. We did a show when I was driving to Disney. We did the whole show. It was a little awkward and clumsy since I was having to do it in the car. However, that episode never went to air. It was unusable. It was because my audio was not usable.
Let me ask. You were in the car, but just from my own recollection, were you actually driving? Or
No,
were you
I
just in the
wasn't
back seat?
No. Yeah, I was in the passenger seat.
Okay, that's a little better. I was thinking like you may have actually just had you had the microphone like somehow tied to your steering wheel. So if you had to make a sharp turn, I'm doing it.
Yeah. And at the time, I don't even know if I can make it work now, because there's technology where you can make that work today. And you see
That's
that
a scary
with,
thing.
With shows that, where they're driving in cars and stuff.
For those listening, we do not condone
show,
podcasting and driving at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I just didn't really have the technology to make that work. I had my microphone at the time. I was able to power it up and make it work.
Sure.
We got through the whole show. My audio was not usable. And so, but it was like...
What review was that again? I forget what we were talking about.
It might have been... I kind of wonder if it was Batman versus Superman or something like that, because our guest was Nate Parsons.
Oh, yeah.
Former co-host of the show.
Yeah.
I remember him being on, but I don't know. Maybe it was a Transformers. I don't know. I honestly can't remember.
I know he was on for the last night, but I think it was before that. I don't think it was that one.
I don't know. I don't recall. But I do remember being in the car and giving that a go. I was like, this is the only time I got. And then it didn't work. And then I guess we re-recorded it later. I
think we tried a second attempt of it later. Yeah, we must have.
Or
it must have been one of those movies where we thought, you know what, this is just not worth it. We're not even going to bother.
Well, because we haven't really skipped a show, especially a main show.
Right.
We've always been able to make that work. So I think we must have re-recorded that. Now, there's been a few extra film episodes over the years.
Yeah, for sure.
We missed some weeks there until Ryan and Jay came on, and then they made it work. But yeah, I mean, it was just a fun little fun look. Anyway,
I forgot.
That's a
you
long
did
story
that.
to say.
Wow.
Let's not do that again.
No, let's. Yeah,
You
not
can
even
record
drinking and
from
driving.
the car, just not
Yeah.
driving.
No podcast and driving. Never
Yeah, there you
do
go.
that.
At any rate, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the InSession Film Podcast. This is Miniver. Good movie.
Greer
like it.
Garson, man.